the latest tech.
I'm Alexa. I can answer your questions.
Interviews.
And we are evolving, and we are seeing an amazing opportunity that's happening.
Accessibility.
Accessibility is one of our core values. It's even a part of our mission statement.
This is DoubleTap TV.
Welcome to another edition of DoubleTap TV. Thank you guys so much for being here each and every single week. And thank you so much for your support and your emails. You send them all to feedback@AMI.CA. I really appreciate you sending all your feedback and comments and criticism and ideas for shows. We love getting emails from you guys. On Twitter, don't forget to DM us. It is @DoubleTapCanada with that hashtag, which is AskDoubleTap. It helps us get to your questions, which we're going to do. We always do this a couple times a year. We get to your emails and we talk all about the questions that you have and we answer them. I am Mark AFLALO with Stephen Scott by my side. Thank you so much for being here with me each and every single week, Stephen. How are you feeling this week?
I feel good, Mark. I'm glad we're talking about this week. It's going to be a really interesting conversation around Apple and Steve Jobs. I know we're going to get into lots of interesting conversations, not just about the man himself, but Tim Cook as well, and the future of Apple and the route that it is taking now, and how that looks from the world of accessibility. How does that factor in to where Apple is going? What is it telling us? So yeah, I'm excited to be here this weekend to talk about this.
Last week we talked about new iPhones, we talked about the new iPad, and we included our friend James Rath, who's known as the blind filmmaker, and he had an opportunity many years ago to sit down with Tim Cook at Apple, and Apple really played an instrumental role in his life as a filmmaker. And the reason we're bringing that up this week is because we have way more of that interview with James Rath that we're going to be bringing you this week, because we're celebrating the life of Steve Jobs, and we're talking about Apple 10 years after his passing. He passed away on October 5th, 2011, at the only age of 56 years old. Way too young and way too genius of a mind for this world to have lost. But nevertheless, we are here today, 10 years later. Tim Cook put in charge about a year before Steve Jobs' passing, and has done a pretty admirable job, I think, with the company. Would you say that is a correct assessment?
Yeah, first let me pay tribute to Steve Jobs, if I may, because this is a guy who, quite frankly, changed the course of history for a company, but also changed the course of history for all of us. The idea that the smartphone was going to change our world in the way that Apple told us it would, nobody quite believed at the time. And, we were all very skeptical of it. I mean, certainly in the blind community, we all thought a slab of glass is going to be accessible to us as blind people. Oh, that's never going to happen. It's never going to work. We are going to be left out. And that didn't happen. And Steve saw to that, and it was one of the first companies to make that effort. So, that is a massive thing to happen. And of course, we all know the impact that smartphones have had on our lives, for good and bad. He is a guy who had a vision. He was a troubled man, of course. He had his own demons, he had his own challenges, but he was a genius, you cannot deny. Now, Tim Cook was a different kind of guy. And for a lot of people, there was a concern that he would just be Mr. Corporate. He would just be that guy who would be the Bill Gates, what Bill Gates was to Microsoft, Tim Cook would become to Apple. And that would be okay, but it would lose a bit of its energy. It would lose a bit of that passion that perhaps... or actually not perhaps, that Steve Jobs did bring. He brought passion, he gave passion, he gave life, I think, soul to the company.
Well, what's interesting is that I remember in my generation, I cannot think of another passing of an individual in the tech world, or really in this, in society, that really struck me as much as the passing of Steve Jobs. I remember I was walking my dog and I read the news, and I immediately called, my friend Mitchell, and we talked about it. And it was a really sad day, because he really was a visionary. And you think back to his history, talk about not only the founding of Apple with Steve Wozniak, but then getting ousted by Apple and immediately founding, Next Computers, which ended up getting bought by Apple again, founding Pixar. He was on the board of Disney. This was a very, very influential individual, and had no real hands-on tech experience. It was all about his creative genius, really the mind and the ideas and the ability to push people. really not only to their limits, but past their limits to create products and services that really did innovate. And that was the concern when he passed was, will Tim Cook, will anybody at Apple be able to replace that or at least keep that going? And I think the word replace is probably not adequate because no one would ever replace Steve Jobs. But I think Tim Cook as a CEO, as a leader, has done a very admirable job of raising and grooming other people in the company and really highlighting those people, because if you remember when Steve Jobs would take the stage, it was the Steve Jobs show for 2 hours. It was never, a couple, other than a couple other people on stage, like really, really few people like Phil Schiller and the voice of Johnny Ive. There wasn't much else. Steve took that stage and everybody paid attention to what he was saying, whereas now in the days since Steve's passing, Tim Cook is definitely there and he's front and center, but he's not scared to share that stage with people that we've never met, people that we have met, and really expose these people and give them an opportunity to shine. And I think, especially during this pandemic where they've had an opportunity to record these presentations and really polish them up in a way that, yes, live was fun, but I found that live was lacking over the past several years with Apple keynotes because it wasn't as rehearsed. There was not that much pressure to get it just perfect every single time. We've heard stories of Steve Jobs practicing, to the wee hours of the night, endlessly over and over and over again, faking things at keynotes to make sure it looked absolutely great. And that was a bit lacking. But these polished keynotes that we've seen in the past, year and a half, 2 years because of the pandemic, really have shown a spotlight on this company in a way that it hasn't before. And we're going to be talking about that history and talking about, the way other people think about Apple on this week's episode. And James Rath is going to be joining us to talk all about that, because you had a great conversation with James, right?
Yeah. James is a great guy, and, someone who has really been, highlighted by Apple, which I think is fantastic. He absolutely deserves that. So I was really glad to get the chance to talk to him because he's doing something that's very different. He's doing something that is not common. He's a blind guy who's making films. And a lot of people would think those two don't go together. But he will prove through his work that it is possible. And that, of course, is inspirational to lots of people, but in particular, blind people who want to do the same.
Well, how did Apple in particular affect the life of James Rath, a blind filmmaker, a friend of our show, someone who is standing by to join us on this week's episode of Double Tap TV. And of course, you guys at home, you have an opinion. I'm sure Apple has touched your life. I'm sure other companies have touched your life. Let us know. Feedback at AMI.CA. And of course, on Twitter, we are at Double Tap Canada with the hashtag, which is AskDoubleTap. We come back with James Rath in just a moment.
For more great Double Tap TV content, visit AMI.CA/DoubleTap. This is Double Tap TV.
We are back on Double Tap TV talking all things Apple in the generation or the decade post the passing of Steve Jobs, the co-founder. I am Mark AFLALO with Stephen Scott by my side. Stephen, you had the opportunity to sit down with a very, very talented individual, a friend of the show, James Rath.
That's right, Mark. And, I was really glad to sit down with James. I always am. And, I love getting the chance to ask him lots of questions about his life in technology and how technology has made such a difference to him. And interestingly, this comes up after an article was resurfaced that was on CNN's website featuring James Rath that talked about how Apple saved his life. And I was quite intrigued to find out more about that. So that's the first question I wanted to pitch to James, was how can a company like Apple save your life?
So that article came out around 2016. I resurfaced it, reshared it just with the 10-year anniversary of Jobs passing, because I think it was just really important to highlight how his leadership wanted to prioritize accessibility within that company in the early 2000s, at a time when no other companies were doing that. If you wanted accessibility in professional, creative, or educational workflow with technology, you're probably paying for subscriptions or all this unnecessary additional assistive technology. And when I was introduced to the Mac for the first time, I didn't have to pay for third-party software, mediocre baked-in accessibility or limited. I went from a 2004, I think it was an Acer Windows XP computer, and I was struggling to, but I loved video and I wanted to edit, so I was trying on Sony Vegas and Windows Movie Maker at the time to do the best I could, and working with like a third-party zooming app. It wasn't the greatest workflow. And once I was introduced to iMovie, and then soon Final Cut 10 came out shortly after I got a Mac, with Zoom and VoiceOver, it changed everything. There was no longer basically a struggle to create. It was simply just a part of the workflow, zooming in naturally with the touchpad or a magic mouse or whatever, or scroll wheel. It was so natural with navigating the screen, and then having things verbally relayed to me that I'm navigating through.
Now, James, you had the opportunity to actually sit down with Tim Cook, like face to face, have a conversation with this man, which is something that not a lot of people in their lives can say. What was that like, meeting Tim Cook?
So this was 2017, and I'm trying to think. I don't even know if I was 21. I may have been 20. Might have been. I was around that age, 2021. Definitely quite nervous. I was kind of like put into a situation I wasn't expecting. Like the opportunity was kind of brought up, and I'm like, that's cool. Okay, yeah, let me think about some questions. Like maybe it wasn't confirmed or anything, because I think his schedule was pretty booked that week. But as I was up there, because I was up there to like talk on for an internal thing at Apple, for their employees, about accessibility for GAD, and suddenly like they confirmed that morning, like, so Tim can fill an hour of his time with you, and I'm just like, oh, okay, so these questions I have, cool, let's do it. I just like, I think I was trying to process it as it was happening, so I definitely like come off pretty nervous in the video. I think if you like want to read my body language, but overall, like I'm pretty proud with how it came out, and for the circumstances, I think it was a really cool conversation to have. This company that's impacted my life, they're not perfect. I send them feedback and critiques all the time with accessibility or things, but they improve. Oftentimes, a lot of those feedback tidbits, they come through within the year with new software updates, which is always cool. And Cook is he's just a cool guy, super genuine, very passionate about what he does, and it was cool to have a conversation even like off camera with him about, like, I don't know, we talked about hiking, coffee, just like things of common interest. Super genuine guy, who he's a lot more than just what you see on their keynotes and interviews and stuff.
James, we can all talk about the impact that Steve Jobs had on our life, and I think that, you know, he did have an impact on those of us who've been following Apple, who've been buying Apple products, who've been part of that ecosystem, that world for a long time, can talk about the impact that he himself had on us. What about you? And let's maybe open this up more widely to the question around accessibility. What impact do you think Steve Jobs had in that specific field of accessibility?
I've definitely seen quite a bit of documentaries, come across articles. I know he had a flawed character, but I admire that he had a vision, and he sought it out, and he surrounded himself with brilliant people who could help. Like, he was a true, I think he was a brilliant creative leader, but also not perfect for sure. And I think there's times too in his life where he acknowledged shortcomings or faults in his philosophy or thinking, and especially there's been a lot of accounts, towards the end of his time here on Earth, where he shared a bit more personally about things. If he had more time, things he'd address or tackle, but that's all like in his book or interviews that you can always follow up on. But I think just overall, he may have not have been like valuing accessibility his whole life, but he surrounded himself around people who made him look at it closer, and really helped to spearhead a team at Apple to take on accessibility and to make sure that they're baking it into their products at no additional cost. which was significant for me in the time that I was growing up. And I'm glad that change happened when it did, because what that's created, I think, especially in the smartphone era that we're in, well, now you have all this accessibility competition, and that's great. Like, that's healthy. Google has had some cool innovations. A lot of the select speak things on Android, I've been a big fan of a lot of their transcription stuff that they've like started on YouTube and then have rolled over to probably from Google speech search into Android, where everything in the OS can be transcribed. That's only creating nothing but healthy competition between Apple, Google, all these other companies, Microsoft, with accessibility, and the more the better. And I think each of them seem to really be strong in some areas, and even Apple has some shortcomings, I think, in some areas of accessibility that they can continue to work at, and I know they are. But overall, Jobs, I think, really did help contribute to the accessibility landscape.
James, do me a favor, stick around. We've got a couple more questions we want to ask you on this week's episode of Double Tap TV. It is Double Tap TV. Stephen Scott and James Rath are standing by. I am Mark AFLALO. If you've got some feedback or some comments, the email address is feedback@AMI.CA, or reach out on Twitter. It is @DoubleTapCanada with the hashtag, which is AskDoubleTap. We come back with more with James Rath after this.
For more great Double Tap TV content, visit AMI.CA/DoubleTap. This is Double Tap TV.
Welcome back to Double Tap TV. Thank you guys so much for being here along for the ride. We are talking all things Apple in the decade post the passing of Steve Jobs, who passed away on October 5th, 2011. I remember that day quite vividly, much like many people who remember certain days in their life. They know where they were, they know what happened. I am Mark AFLALO with my co-host by my side, Stephen Scott from Glasgow, Scotland. Stephen, James Rath is still with us.
Yep, James is still here. Great to have you with us this week, James. I want to broaden out our conversation on accessibility, because what I've noticed is over the past couple of years, and I'm intrigued to know your take on this, I've noticed that companies like Microsoft are really pushing the message of accessibility out to their customers, out to their business customers as well, really talking about the value of accessibility. I don't see companies like Apple doing that. I see some other companies doing it, like Google, and I've seen Samsung do it, to maybe a lesser extent Amazon. Certainly everybody's putting in their fair share of effort into making sure that products are accessible. No denial of that. It's the actual conversation about accessibility out there in the public, making people aware of what accessibility tools are, how they impact us as in our case, blind and partially sighted people, the difference they make to our working life, making us more capable. All that is key. I see Apple putting in the effort, but I don't see them talking about it as much. Your take on that?
I mean, based on, I've definitely seen Microsoft leading some marketing campaigns, which is great. LinkedIn, even, which is owned by Microsoft, had an amazing campaign recently with some disabled advocates. And even Google has had a lot of disability stories featured in I/O and in their conferences. But I mean, I think it'd be wrong to say Apple hasn't, because they've mentioned accessibility in their events. Looking at the last in-person WWDC, voice control had an entire several minutes talking about this new major feature coming across all the software updates, and it had Craig Federighi showcasing it right there on the main stage in their regular developer keynote. So could they be doing more? Absolutely. And I hope to see more like commercial campaigns. I hope to see more marketing in that realm. But I think they've definitely done their part with featuring accessibility related stories, or at least features baked in with everything else. Along with that, even their support channel on YouTube, which has these quick, snappy tutorials. They mix in like how to hard reset your iPhone or things like that. But then they also just have how to use speak screen, how to use voiceover, how to use Zoom or Magnify. Like, it's all all right there, right on their main YouTube channel.
James, you offer such great insight, especially from your point of view, but I got to ask a question going back to last week's show, because Stephen was so excited about the iPad Mini 6. I'm curious what your takeaways are from that new iPad Mini 6, because it's such a pocketable device.
I'm focused right now on a project that kind of requires an iPad Pro. With like the 5G and the 2 terabytes, using an iPad as like an on-site production device, so I can like have people sign documents, such as like talent release forms, backup footage, have that go up to a cloud for even further backing up, connected to Thunderbolt SSDs. So the iPad Pro for me kind of makes a little bit more sense at this time with my professional workflow and the projects I'm about to be taking on. But an iPad Mini as a consumption device, to watch videos, to go through photos, or even just it can be used for creation. It's a smaller display, so if you like GarageBand, iMovie, even other creative apps like Procreate that are out there, works with the Pencil 2nd generation. It's great for that, but I think it's really kind of catering best to people who just want to sit on a couch or on their bed with a nice iPad.
James Rath, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this week. Please come back on another show. Stephen, I cannot wait to have James on again. He has become quite a friend of the show, has he not?
Yep, James is always welcome here. You can find him online by searching for The Blind Filmmaker. And of course, he's on all those social networky things as well.
Social networky things, just like us. If you want to email us, it's feedback@AMI.CA. If you want to follow us on our social networky things, you can start with Twitter. It is @DoubleTapCanada with the hashtag, which is AskDoubleTap. And of course, on all other social networky things, it is at doubletap.online. On behalf of our guests, James Rath and Stephen Scott, I am Mark AFLALO. Thank you for being here. We'll catch you on our next episode of Double Tap TV.
Hosted by Mark AFLALO and Stephen Scott. Editing, Jordan Steeves and Mark AFLALO. Voiceover, Anna Vicino. Integrated Described Video Specialist, Ron Rickford. Coordinating Producer, Jennifer Johnson. Director, Production, CARA Nye. Director Programming, Brian Perdue. VP Content Development and Programming, John Melville. President and CEO, David Arrington. Copyright 2021, Accessible Media, Inc.